Dr. Jazz.
I wanted to ask you this.
Jazz.
I listened to your music ever since Binney gave me this one, Afinidad, and
Afinidad.
yeah, and I think this if you put this one on the CD player, it doesn't play anymore because it's completely worn out like a record almost. But uh, I wanted to ask you about your last one, Solo Life. First of all, I haven't seen you even on YouTube. There's not a lot of footage of you playing solo piano live. I mean, even solo piano and especially the repertoire. I love the repertoire also. Monk's tunes, Monk's Mood, and Monk's Dream, and Lush Life by Billy Strayhorn. And how did this one happen? And how did you approach playing these tunes? And why these tunes actually? Were these people, I guess, important for your jazz development also?
Well, to address the first part of your question, the reason you haven't heard or seen a lot of footage of me playing solo is because I really haven't started doing it until recently.
Really? Oh, wow. How come?
Well, I've been focusing most of my career on ensemble playing, and it wasn't until I moved to the Bay Area where I'm living now, about 8 years ago, I moved here, and I played at I taught at a very famous camp here, a jazz camp called Jazz Camp West.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, I met a lot of local musicians in the area, and I also met um, a presenter locally here in Oakland, which is a piano store called Piedmont Piano Company.
Ah, okay.
And there's a piano store where they have concerts, they have a stage, and the owner really loves jazz. He's a good friend of mine, Jim Callahan, and he told me you should come down and play at the store because he has some amazing pianos there, and he has a lot of solo pianists play there. So I decided to do it, and it became that was sort of uh, something I've been wanting to do for a while, but the opportunity hadn't really presented itself, and so it became a sort of an annual tradition.
Okay.
I would play at the store every year in the summertime.
Oh, that's cool. Oh.
So the first concert was kind of following this camp that I taught at Jazz Camp West, and then it was so successful, it was so fun, and it was such a great experience for me that I decided I should do this every year, and that really helps me to continue to think about repertoire and evolve and develop my solo piano playing, because solo piano is a very it takes some time to develop
Yeah.
a voice as a solo pianist, particularly if it's not something you've been doing all along, which I really hadn't been. So that's how that got started. And actually, this album that I just released, Solo Live, was a live concert at Piedmont Piano in July of 2019.
19, yeah.
Yeah, and so and the question whenever you are going to do a solo concert always becomes, is it going to be originals? Is it going to be standards, or
Yeah.
or a combination, or is it going to be improvised or notated? And of course, there's so many possibilities available. Because with solo pianos, yeah, I mean, there's a whole world that opens up. There's a whole possibilities. Anything you can do, anything really. And also, not to say that you're limited with an ensemble, but with an ensemble, you have more collective choices that you have to make.
Yeah, this is more intimate in
Whereas,
a way.
yeah, it's more intimate, and you can like make more spare of the moment decisions as well. So I decided, you know, that I wanted to play, you know, mostly standards and some originals. I mean, obviously, I love to write, and but I've never really written for solo piano
Mm.
per se, except maybe one or two compositions that appeared in my trio
Yeah.
records. Um, so I wanted instead to really kind of take it as an opportunity to focus on standards of composers who I really loved, and see how I could arrange those for solo piano, and taking inspiration from the solo pianists that I really love.
Yeah, yeah. Is the
Like,
solo piano heritage? That's what I wanted to ask you. Like, we have, I don't know, Art Tatum, and starting there or going even further back, and you have the European Keith Jarrett whole direction, and then you have the Cecil Taylor, and how do you see yourself? I mean, then you have, of course, the South American, or Cuban, Latin American, Chucho Valdez, and all these incredible other players who are there.
yeah.
How did you blend those influences? Because when I listen to when I listen to you play, or even to this solo record now, you seem to have blended everything into your voice, even if you play solo. I mean, successfully. But how is your view on this?
Yeah, it's the three main traditions that have informed my playing in general and my writing um, are Latin American music. That was the first style of music that I grew up playing. That sort of is really my roots. And then classical music is something that I have always continued to play and study, and I discovered that pretty early on, around 10 years old,
Mm.
11 years old, when I first started learning and playing classical music. Um, and in more recent times, I've been playing it more, actually, and studying it more, and actually doing some solo piano recitals. I did
Oh,
some
really?
classical recitals here in San Francisco. That also has been kind of a positive influence to move into this area. It's something that because San Francisco has such an important classical music scene.
Yeah.
I was right before the pandemic. I was invited. I had the opportunity to curate a series of concerts for San Francisco Performances, which is one of the main classical presenters here in San Francisco, and they asked me to curate 4 different concerts, and and 2 of those were solo piano concerts. One was
Oh, wow.
strictly a classical recital of the music of Monpo, who is a classical composer that I really, really, really love, whose music I love. And the other one was a jazz recital. Um, and so uh, classical music has always played a very important part in my
Yeah.
development. And of course, jazz. I'm principally a jazz improviser, and that's
Yeah.
what I've done professionally and devoted my career to. So it took several years for me to learn how to consolidate and bring
Mm.
my influences together in a cohesive way, even as a jazz player.
Yeah.
I found that I had to first devote myself very strictly to playing learning the jazz language and the jazz tradition, in very intentionally trying to disregard my other influences, let's say,
Yeah.
at least for a time, during the formative years I'm speaking of, even though that was always there. But, I wanted to be very focused about learning the jazz tradition. And then, by the time I started, in the later years with Bobby, and then when I joined Terence Blanchard's band, I really, was starting to find ways to consolidate all of those influences, more specifically the Latin American influences, into my jazz playing to a way that felt natural,
Yeah.
In terms of how that applies to solo piano, I mean, I think I'm still, to be frank with you, I'm still finding my place in the realm of solo piano, because there are, like you mentioned, there are so many currents that one could take. And I think I'm leaning myself, at least for the time being, more towards playing standards and bringing my Latin influence to that, and of course my classical training. But I would like to move eventually in the direction of more improvised solo piano playing.
Oh wow! Yeah, I would love to hear that. I would love to hear that. Yeah.
In fact, I will just give you a preview that this repertoire of Monpeau that I played in San Francisco, when the pandemic happened, SF Performances asked me to play this recital again, but pre-record it so that they could offer it to their listeners on their website. Many presenters right now, because they had to shut down, they are either streaming or pre-recording concerts. And so they asked me to do this. And I did it at a very beautiful church in Marin County. And so I recorded this material of Monpeau, mostly the collection of pieces called Música Callada, which means silent music. They're very simple, sparse pieces. And when I was finished with recording them, I still had a little bit of time left. And so I improvised some pieces that were, in some way, Monpeau's music was still in the air. So it was in some way kind of coming from what had just happened. And I'm now going to start listening back to that material and finding a way to put it all together, so the improvisations interspersed with the Monpeau pieces, and that I'm thinking that will be my next solo.
Oh wow, beautiful, fantastic. Yeah, that's beautiful. We'll get to hear also this side, the classical with the improv. It's like, Jarrett, when you listen to Jarrett, let's say the Köln concert, I mean, since speaking solo piano, there's so many of classical influences there, of European influences, of course, and incredible. Yeah, but nice to hear that also that you will approach this solo piano playing also in this way. I love that. Beautiful. Yeah. But you I wanted to catch you there. You mentioned before you love composing, and I mean that's of course on the first sight really visible, because you've been extremely productive through your career as a composer, especially already I think on the first album of Greg, there's like this one tune of yours, one composition, and throughout the 90s. But what's your approach? I listened to so much to, let's say, Sorrows and Triumphs, and even earlier stuff, Afinidad stuff. And I sometimes have this challenge of just taking a record and writing the lead sheet or creating a lead sheet. With you, this is a problem, man. It's, I mean, especially rhythmically, let's say, how do you approach composition in general, or from which angles? I mean, of course, it differs. You sometimes, I guess, touch it from a melodical point, sometimes from harmonical or rhythmical, but in general, how do you start? Do you just sit down, or do ideas pop up, or what's your progress there?
You know, I would say generally I begin at the piano, developing harmonic or melodic ideas. Sometimes those two come together. A lot of times it can be some sort of harmonic structure that I'm working with.
Yep.
And I just try to sit with those cells, let's call them. You know, they're like little cells that generate more. I generate more material from them.
Yeah.
I find ways of manipulating them, either, you know, through stacking them on top of each other, or, you know, inverting them, or just finding all kinds of ways that I can work with. I like the idea of working with a small idea and trying to make the most out of it, you know? And then once it starts to take more of a shape, you know, and maybe a melody comes later, you know, then kind of the rhythmic element always starts to find its way, because I find that groove is such an important element in music in general. The music that I love to listen to is always has a very strong, well, not always, that's not true, but a lot of the music that I enjoy listening to has a very strong groove, you know, including jazz, of course. And that's how I really, you know, find that I can connect at a very physical, visceral level with music. It's through rhythm, you know, and it's just kind of part of my makeup. And so I oftentimes like finding different rhythmic relationships in either different tempos or meters, you know, metric modulations. This is, I think, a development of jazz composition that it's been happening a lot in guys from my generation. You know? It's not, you know, there's a lot of us working with this kind of idea of very rhythmic complexity. I think in general, jazz has really evolved rhythmically in the you know, compositionally in the last decade or more. You know, people like Miguel Zenon is very rhythmically sophisticated, his music. David Sanchez, you know, and Danilo Perez, and of course taking in this whole all of these influences from Latin American music, which is very rhythmically rich, makes the combination of that with the understanding of, you know, with jazz harmony and jazz concepts of improvisation is what makes, I think, the music of these players that I mentioned very, very sophisticated and very enriching, very compelling.
Yeah, it's very groovy still, you know, it's, you know, it's, I listen like uninvited thoughts, you know, you have that repetitive pattern going on, one note, but yet it just starts there and then it goes like into this incredible musical universe, you know, and you seem to be so comfortable when playing it also. Whatever, you know, of course it's your tune, but still, you know, there's constant shifting, like you said. And how do you train yourself, or did you, I mean, to be so comfortable in this environment, rhythmical?
Yeah, you know, I think really the best way to do this is to actually dive in and write music that addresses those challenges. In fact, you can use
Yeah.
composition as a vehicle for growing as a player. If you write, you can write a composition that addresses any kind of uh, weakness in your playing, let's call it,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
area that you want to make stronger, whether that is an odd meter or whether it is, metric modulation, and I'm just speaking rhythmically now, but it doesn't have to just be rhythmically. It could be certain kind of harmonic movements
Yeah.
or sounds, chordal chordal sounds. But if you write a composition that really addresses, say, a very rhythmically complex structure, then just by the nature of learning how to play it and actually performing it,
Yeah.
that really, I think that's the best way to do it. I think what's happened is over the years I've been playing with a lot of other players who are writing uh, kind of similarly, along the same lines,
Yeah.
and having to learn to play their music has just made me stronger in that way as well.
Yeah.
So it's really putting yourself surrounding yourself with the people who are thinking along those
Oh,
lines,
like,
who are
yeah.
writing that way,
Yeah. 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 I mean, already in the beginning, I mentioned the Osby mind game. So already there, it's like,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly. So the M-Bass group
yeah.
of musicians were already planting those seeds that early on. They were dealing with, finding ways they were experimenting with odd meters,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they were mostly dealing with other like grooves, like funk grooves, and other elements as well. But so yeah, those seeds were planted pretty early on by Greg Osby and Steve Coleman,
Yeah. Sure.
um, Jerry Allen,
Yeah.
all of those musicians that were part of that music scene. I was very fortunate to have had contact with those musicians, particularly with Greg, pretty early on in '88. That's the first time that I had ever recorded on an album.
But you were like 19,
And
right?
his
Then.
music was very, yeah,
Wow. That's
yeah, it was
cool.
very, very young. And, Greg was writing some very forward
Yeah.
thinking music, very modern sounding
Yeah.
music, involving electronics as well. Um, and so, I've been working with these ideas from pretty early on. And so, to again, to answer your question, I think if we just put ourselves in those kinds of musical situations,
Yeah.
that starts to really get us thinking and hearing music in that way, and then you just become more comfortable with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Schofield once told me, like, that he always used to play a phrase, let's say, over a diminished chord. And then he said, like, okay, that he wrote a composition with a line that he always played over a diminished chord. So if he plays this in the head, that means I cannot play it in the solo, because it's like, playing it all the time. I mean, I don't know if he really meant it, but I guess, it's the same thing what you're saying, actually. If you want to learn how to play in 7, you write a tune in 7, and then yeah, that's a smart tool.
It's so you can use composition as a tool for learning,
Yeah.
And address anything that you really want to get better at. Because if you think about it, it's all familiarity. I think that when something is difficult for us, it's simply because it's unfamiliar to us.
Yeah. Exactly.
When we play a tune in G flat or D flat, if we're having difficulty, it is simply because we haven't spent that much time with that key, But this is why we jazz musicians have to transpose and learn to
Yeah,
transpose whatever it is that we're playing, so that all those keys are familiar to us. And when we encounter those situations, we know where
exactly.
things are in our instrument, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the same is true with anything, any other aspect of music, rhythmic as well. Um, Certain cultures, odd, what we call odd meters. I don't really like to even call them odd. I prefer the term compound meters.
Yeah, yeah.
But in certain cultures, compound meters are the most natural thing.
Man, like on the Balkans, in Serbia, let's say, or Macedonia, kids are playing in like one, two, two, taka, 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 like a 7, 3, 3, 2,
Yeah,
2, and they don't even
yeah,
know they're playing in 7, and then they start to make, like tuku, tu, kaka, kaka, ta, 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 playing, all over, like triplets and everything, and they never get lost, and it's, and you're like, man,
yeah.
what are you doing there? I played once in Skopje in Macedonia, and I saw those guys, and I asked, like, do you know what you're doing? No, no, it's natural. I was like, man, you're like playing, 3 over and triplets and 5 and everything. It's just,
Yeah.
and for them, it's so natural. It's incredible, really, to see that. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah, yeah. So, if you want to get better at playing that time signature, it probably would benefit you to spend some time with those guys,
Yeah,
playing
yeah,
that
sure,
music.
sure,
You-
definitely. Yeah, but we mentioned Osby. I wanted to ask you. There's like, thinking inside you is on the first. I mean, on this record of Osby, meaning like you started with composition very early when you were almost, I guess, a teenager, and basically 2 questions hidden here. But uh, how did you start writing music and when? And how did you end up in Greg's band? Actually, I mean, how is that story?
Yeah. Well, I think writing music has come pretty natural to me. I was always curious and interested in how music worked, how things were put together.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think the first composition I remember writing was one that actually ended up being recorded by Kevin Eubanks.
Oh yes,
Uh,
yeah, you played on 2 records of Kevin. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I played on some records with Kevin, and there's a composition called Sandra that Kevin recorded. I was very fortunate that the guys that I was playing with, like Kevin and Greg, were some the first 2 band leaders to hire me on a kind of on an international level,
Yeah,
let's say. And both of them I met in Philadelphia. So at the time, I was living in Philly, where I attended High School of Arts, and I also went to the University of the Arts, which is where a school where you can get a degree in
yeah.
jazz. And I was living in Philly and playing gigs locally, mostly with Latin music, Latin bands, because that's what I knew how to do best. But I was trying as much as possible to play with jazz musicians, to
Hmm.
play jazz gigs. One of the musicians that I started to play with was Charles Fambro,
Oh really?
bassist
Oh yeah, 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 sure. Really? Oh wow.
with our Blake and Jazz Messengers. Yeah, because
I
he
didn't
was
know.
from Philly, and he had moved back to Philly after already, lived in New York and had been on the roads for many years. And Charles had a steady gig in a hotel in a small town called New Hope, Pennsylvania. And it was a trio gig where they had a piano. So he would sometimes invite me to play there, because at the time, Charles loved playing Latin music.
Oh really? I didn't know. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was looking to play jazz. So, our interests sort of like, we needed each other. I wanted to learn how to swing and play more jazz, and he wanted to play more Latin music. So, anytime we called a tune a standard, he always wanted to play it in a Latin style, and I wanted to swing. And Charles knew Greg and knew Bobby Watson, and he would invite musicians from New York as special guests to come and play with us. And that's how I met Bobby, and that's how I met Greg Osby. And Greg even stayed at my house one of those instances that he came down to play. And we got to know each other, and he started introducing me to his compositions and his albums and his music. And it really opened my mind to a lot of possibilities that I wasn't aware of. And eventually he called me to play. He was the first one to take me to Europe. I went to Germany to play at the Moors Festival.
Oh, really? Oh, man. When was that? Like 89 or?
That must have been in 89.
Yeah. Wow.
89.
Yeah.
And I was still living in Philadelphia. I hadn't even moved to New York. And then after that, he asked me to come and record on that album, Mind Games.
Ah, okay. Wow.
And so I moved to New York in the summer of 88. Yeah, I think that's right. Summer of 88. And I started, in 89, shortly after I moved to New York, I started playing with Kevin Eubanks, who I also met in Philadelphia.
Philly, yeah.
Kind of through Charles,
Wow.
Because Kevin is from Philly.
Yeah.
And so we played at a session. I was playing some gig locally that Kevin came and sat in at, and he really liked my playing and asked me to start playing in his band. He was starting to really tour during that time. It was Gene Jackson on drums.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And eventually it was Kenny Davis on bass, and myself, so it was a quartet.
Oh, wow, man. That's good.
Yeah, it was a great band, and we made a few records. He was on GRP Records at the time.
Oh, yeah, Searcher. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly, Searcher. So we made
I have that one.
And then he got called to LA to play at the Jay Leno show. And so that was the end of that. Like there was no more tour, no more band.
Oh, shit. Yeah.
So that really only lasted a couple of years, and then by that time, I was doing more stuff with Greg, playing more with Greg, and also Bobby Watson started to call me to to play with him.
Yeah.
And eventually I joined his band. I subbed first. I replaced John Hicks, who was playing in Bobby's band before me.
Oh, yeah.
And so then, I really kind of moved in that direction of more straight ahead and play more traditionally, But I always loved the more experimental music. And, I love what Greg does and all those players from that school.
Yeah.
But I felt like I really needed to assimilate the language, the tradition, and Bobby's band was really instrumental for that. With Victor Lewis on drums.
Yeah, I mean, you played on a couple of Victor's records also, right? I think then in the 90s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, that's right. There's one called Family Portrait.
Yeah. With Seamus. Is Seamus there? Blake? No, he's not.
No, Seamus is on. There's another one called. I think it's called Hayes Me You're Talking To. I think it's, or maybe it's called Yes. I'm not sure. because
Yeah, I
don't
think I
remember
have
the
that
title
one
of the
too. Yeah.
yeah, it's Eddie Henderson,
Yeah,
Seamus Blake,
yeah, it's a killing record.
and I think it's I don't remember who's playing bass on that one. If it's Ed Howard, it might have been Ed
I think
Howard.
it's Ed Howard. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I love
So
those groups. Yeah, I mean, you were immediately then when you moved to New York. I mean, when you tell these stories now, really immediately involved in touring and playing as a sideman, right? I mean, like all these
yeah,
groups.
I was very fortunate in that sense that I had already made some connections before I moved to New York through Charles, and all of these musicians that I met kept telling me, if you should move to New York, and they were encouraging me to do that. And I was in college at the time, so I transferred to the Manhattan School of Music. I took a semester off. Excuse me. I took a semester off from school and transferred to the Manhattan School of Music. And by the time I was in school, I think which must have been the spring of '89. I was already playing so much.
Yeah, incredible.
I just could not keep up with my schoolwork. You know?
Incredible.
And so I was very fortunate in that sense. It really, I almost started working right away when I moved to New York.
Wow.
Yeah, very fortunate.
How did the story you mentioned Terence also before Blanchard, and how did then because when you chronologically now it's like, okay, Charles, then the same time kind of Kevin Eubanks, Greg Osby, Bobby Watson, and then immediately you jumped on the Terence train. How did that transition happen, or the gig with Terence?
Yeah, so I was in Bobby's band for about 5 years, and so I was already establishing myself as a well-known side player in New York. And I just got the call out of the blue from Terrence's manager.
Oh,
Um, he at the time, Bruce Barth was playing his band, and I guess Bruce was leaving the band, and he had heard of me, and he called me. I'd never met Terence
oh,
before.
interesting.
So I think he had heard me played. I'm guessing on recordings because I don't even know if he might have heard me live. And yeah, it was just one of those things where it was. I got the call out of the blue,
Yeah.
and I was yeah, very very thrilled to join his band, and I played with him for I stayed with him for about 8 years.
Wow, that's a long one. Yeah.
Long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And so first it was uh, John Thomas on bass
Nice. Yeah.
and Troy Davis on drums. Terrence, I'm trying to think. I think when we first started, it might have just been quartet. I don't think he even had a tenor player in the beginning.
Oh, really?
And
Oh,
then he
wow, man.
invited, yeah, and then he invited. Oh man, I'm spacing on his name. Who still plays with him? I think.
No,
Uh,
Walter Smith. He came later, right?
yeah, Walter came later, but there was a tenor saxophonist who played with him for a very long, long time. Was a fantastic player.
Yeah.
Um, I'm spacing on his name. I'll think of it later. Really, really great. Um, but anyway, it was a very productive period with
Yeah.
Terrence, and you know, he was already doing a lot of film work,
Yeah, I
and
saw that
so
you did two records, two films, soundtracks also. Yeah.
I played on several soundtracks that
Several. Oh, yeah. Okay.
several that he recorded because uh, almost always he would use piano, and so I was often asked to play on those sessions, and um, it was really, thanks to my classical background
Yeah.
training, I just needed to get my reading skills a little bit better, um, and yeah, that again, it was one of those things where, like, by putting myself in that situation, I really had to get my reading together quickly because it's nothing more embarrassing than having a whole orchestra
Oh
have
man.
to,
Yeah.
do something over again because you messed up,
Yeah.
and so it was high, kind of stressful in the beginning for me, the first couple of sessions with orchestra, and so because those guys read, that's what they do all the time, so
Sure.
they're very great sight readers. But in jazz, that's not a skill that we always, utilize very much. It's more improvising.
Yeah.
So I needed to really spend more time, even though I had studied classical music. Like sight reading was never something I did a lot of. So um, it was shading time. I had to kind of get
Yeah.
a little more.
Yeah. How was Terence? And I mean, and all these guys you mentioned. I mean, I wanted because I'm kind of wanted to lead to the question of you becoming a band leader, but just how were Terence and Bobby and Greg and Kevin and Charles actually? I mean, as band leaders, if you compare them, and I guess their ways differed from each other's or not.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, I just thought of the tenor player's name is Bryce Winston.
Oh sure,
He
yeah. Oh man,
plays
yeah,
with
yeah,
Terence. I think he may still
yeah, yeah. Exactly.
fantastic tenor player, Bryce
Yeah.
Winston.
He's on Wandering Moon, I think, also. Yeah.
Yes, he's on
Yeah,
Wandering
exactly.
Moon.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, all of one of the things that was common between Terence and Bobby, even though they have very different personalities, but
Yeah.
they both play with Art Blakey. So all of the guys who play with Art Blakey and Charles Fembrough as well, they all had kind of a similar approach in that they basically would let you give you a lot of freedom to do what you wanted to do. Like let the musicians, kind of like the Miles school of thought, like let the musicians play.
Yeah.
Not a lot of direction, but with Bobby, Bobby did have to point my ears towards the blues because at that time of my development, I was still, like I said, I was still kind of trying to assimilate the language of jazz, and he really kind of stressed to me the importance of the blues. So I needed to tune into that more and making sure, finding ways that could always be present in my playing. Even though it's a little more subtle, well, depending on the player, but let's say in general in jazz, the presence of the blues is a little more, it can be more in the undercurrent than in the foreground.
Yeah.
It varies from stylistically, but it's definitely something that we all have to address
Sure.
as jazz musicians.
Sure.
And so Bobby really was great at pointing that out to me. And then, of course, the importance of swing, like learning how to really develop your ideas rhythmically, all within the framework of the swing feel.
Yeah.
Always maintaining that feel, particularly in mid tempos and slow tempos.
Yeah. That's heavy. Those are heavy, man. Yeah.
Yeah. Learning not to get away from that and staying with it and not doubling the time, so those guys knew how to do that very well.
And Victor on drums, I mean, he's master of that.
Yeah. So, and so I needed, it was a great formative period for me. Um, and with Terence, because he's from New Orleans, it was interesting because playing with him, I could really feel for the first time how that connection is right there in the music, like how it
Mm.
comes from the traditional New Orleans music, the second line, and those rhythms, which have a strong connection to the Caribbean as well. So
Sure.
it
Yeah.
was kind of coming full circle for me, like this emphasis on four every other bar, like in the second line, where the ding, 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 ding,
Yeah. Yeah.
ding, 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 that that emphasis on four every other bar is something that was kind of unique. And we in Latin music also
Sure. Yeah.
have,
That's
have that that emphasis on four on the three side of the clave.
yeah.
So it was like coming full circle, like seeing all these connections. It was really really cool. But yeah, they all, both Terence and Bobby and Charles, they always were full of stories about our Blakey.
Man,
So
yeah. I would
being
love
around,
to hear
yeah,
that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, being around them was like really feeling like you were connecting to the lineage.
Yeah.
Um, for example, one story that Bobby would tell me, it's like as young players we would get tired of playing some of the same tunes all the time. And Bobby told me that if you complain to Art about playing the same tune all the time, particularly a ballad. I think it was Terence who might have told me that they kept playing the same ballad every night on the road for like a whole
Weeks. Yeah.
weeks and months. So he was like, man, I'm tired of playing this thing. Can we play another one? So if you went to Art and complained, the next night he would feature you on it. Just out of nowhere, like when it came time to play the tune, and tonight we're going to feature on this beautiful ballad, our trumpeter Terence Blanchard.
Oh man, that's kaput. There you go.
uh, and so that's like a very old school
Yeah.
of learning music. That's kind of the tools that they would use, the old guys, to teach. You learn by doing and by they putting you in the spot.
Yeah. Exactly.
So if you think about it, in essence, that's what jazz is. It's just learning how to be comfortable with uncertainty, number one, and being able to come up with ideas in the spur of the moment.
Yeah.
And it's when you put yourself in those situations that you really find what you need to do.
Yeah. Definitely. Yep. I mean, that's how have we all learned, I guess. To be on stage and just be thrown into water and learn how to swim, I guess. Then
Yeah.
drowning every now and then. So, but these the musicians you played with, did they encourage you to become I'm referring to Beauty Within, because it's like, speaking of being uncomfortable, I would be so afraid. I mean, Horacio, and Anthony Jackson, that's like, yeah, I mean, and you being, I don't know, you were 24 probably, or 25, but like, did those guys you played with encourage you to become a band leader, or when was the moment you felt comfortable to do that record? And
Yeah, I would say that when I was with Bobby, he was really kind of being very focused in trying to keep a band together, you know.
Mm.
So he wasn't necessarily encouraging me to lead my own band. You know, I think those those even though the Young Lions movement was already starting to happen then,
Yeah.
that was really something that was more instigated by the record labels.
Yeah.
I think the general thinking of the musicians was, you know, that you should spend time playing with the elders first for a number of years before you would go out on your own.
Yeah.
Because that's sort of how that was the paradigm that they grew up with. You know, you spend years with Art Blakey or, you know, Betty Carter or whoever it was, you know, that had young players coming in. And that way you developed your playing and you became strong and, you know, and play with several people. And then, you know, you would start band leading, you know, or Red Rodney was another
Yeah.
one, you know,
Yeah.
that Chris Potter
Chris
started
played. Yeah,
when he
sure.
was
Yeah.
young. And so, you know, there were bands like that. And that was the paradigm back then. You know, now it's changed, of course, with all this academic
Yeah.
programs in schools, in the world of academia. So, you know, I wasn't really, at that time, I didn't feel like encouragement to start leading my own band. But I did love to write music, and you know, and I wanted to have it recorded, and you know, and I opportunities were presenting themselves for me to record my music, um, and I started to do it pretty early on.
Yeah.
And that first album with Anthony and Horacio, you know, that was kind of uh, you know, just certain forces coming together. It was like a very unique opportunity because
Yeah.
Horacio had just moved to the United States. I met Horacio first in Italy when he defected from Cuba and stayed in Italy. And he lived in Italy for, you know, several months. I don't know how long he stayed there, but he told me, I'm going to move to New York. You know, he already had it in his mind that he wanted to move to New York. And I said, well, you know, I'll be waiting, and we'll play together when you do. You know, I think I was in Italy playing at one of those festivals in Perugia, you know, and we crossed paths at a jam session. That's how we
Wow,
first
man.
met
Ooh.
in Italy, and he was living there. And so when he finally moved to New York, you know, we hooked up again, and this opportunity to make an album for AudioQuest, which is the
Yeah.
company I made my first album for, that one that you mentioned, Beauty Within. I asked Horacio to join me, and I had met Anthony through Roland Vasquez, who was a drummer and composer who was teaching at the Manhattan School of Music where I was going to school.
Okay.
And Roland had his own band, and he invited me to play with him a couple of times locally in New York City, and Anthony was the bassist.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's how I met Anthony. And, you know, I was always very kind of scared by Anthony because he's a very kind of serious musician, serious guy. You know, he's a very serious, very focused personality. Like, you know, no joking around when you're around Anthony. Um, and such a perfectionist, you know, and
Man,
such
the sound and the groove. Dude, man.
yeah. I
It's
mean,
like
he was such
killing.
a ridiculous player that it was
Yeah.
almost like overwhelming at times, you know. And I'll tell you a kind of a funny story. When we were making that album, Beauty Within, that was in at Systems 2,
Oh
Brooklyn,
yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Brooklyn, which is no longer around, unfortunately, that studio. But we made it in that studio. I remember that, you know, for a long time, that studio had a white Kawai piano, you know, but finally they acquired a great piano, a Steinway D, a concert grand 9 foot. And it was shortly after they got that piano that I made that recording in that studio. And when we were in the studio together, I really hadn't played with Anthony all that much other than that 1 or 2 gigs locally in New York with Roland Vasquez. And, we did some rehearsals, a couple of rehearsals, and we went to the studio. And when we were recording, I think it was Mastery of All Situations, which was kind of hard-hitting.
Yeah. So.
And we're in the middle of it, we're getting into it, and I turn around and I look at Anthony, and, his face was transformed. And, I'm sure you've seen him play, but
sure,
he makes some incredibly weird looking faces when he's playing.
Yeah, almost angry.
Almost angry, intense looks, his head shakes and it's like, it looks like he's possessed by something. And it was so like shocking to me to see him right there in the studio that it was distracting for me, And so I couldn't look at him. I had to turn away and just kind of look away or look at the piano.
Oh man!
Because it was like so intense, the look, that I would get distracted by it, and I would couldn't focus on my own playing.
Oh man!
And, and then one of the other things that I remember very much about that session was that the kind of questions that Anthony would ask when we would go into the control room to listen, we would listen to a take that we did, and he would ask me things like, well, what did you think about the ensemble playing on that one?
Oh wow, yeah. He always seemed to be a team player. I mean,
yeah. In fact, he really could care less whether he had a solo or not. Like, I always kept thinking, oh man, Anthony, I'm sorry, I should give you more solos. Maybe you could play on this one. And he was like, I'd never feel like I need to solo, because the way he's playing is so much part of the music and making the music what it is, and it's so virtuosic anyway.
Yeah.
That it's almost like his solos are not all that different from what he normally does when he's accompanied.
Yeah. Yeah, he's so supportive. I mean, incredible. Yeah.
And those kinds of questions really had me thinking a lot. I was pretty young then, so I wasn't really, I was, as we like to say, pretty green. That was my first album. I wasn't thinking about those things, like what is the ensemble playing on this take? Are we really making the transitions together seem smooth? The dynamics, are we playing the dynamics together? Are we stating the main theme, feeling the music together? There's all kinds of considerations that I wasn't
sure. It's
on an intellectual level, I wasn't thinking along those lines.
Yeah.
So it was a great learning experience for me to be around Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, to have such a rhythm section for your first album, that's like, it's overwhelming. It's
Yeah, I was very, very fortunate. Yeah.
So very beautiful. Yeah. And Eduardo, otherwise, I just wanted not to take too much of your time, but so nice to listen to you, to talk about these things. It's just, how did the connection with Binney happen? I mentioned Afinidad before already, and you guys seem to be going for more than 25 years or even longer, I guess. La Bikina, I know Dave gave me that album. That was
right.
And
I'm glad you brought that up. So yeah, my relationship with Dave goes way back. I met Dave shortly after I moved to New York. And what's funny is that at the time when I was attending Manhattan School of Music, I was taking lessons from Harold Danko, who was my piano teacher.
Yeah, wow, really?
Yeah, he was my piano teacher.
Wow.
And Harold had an apartment right across the street from Dave on 72nd Street, from where Dave lived. Dave lived in this apartment on 72nd Street for many years.
I watched his cat many times. Many, a
Yes,
couple of times.
yes. So Dave would see me walk up to go to my lessons with Harold. But the way we met, know, as I remember, he seeked me out because he was looking to make his first record, Point Game,
Point game,
on
yeah.
Owl Records, which he received some kind of grant from the NEA that allowed him to make that recording. So he was looking for a band, and I think he had heard me in Greg's album, Mind Games, and he came to a gig where I was playing with Kevin Eubanks somewhere in the city,
Oh,
and we had never met, and we ran into each other in the bathroom, and then he just introduced himself and started talking to me and told me he wanted to play with me, and and we did. I don't remember when was the first time that we played together, but certainly kind of the first project that we did together was that first album of his, Point Game, which is really great.
oh
Really,
man,
really
yeah.
great.
It's like such an
Adam
underrated
Smith is
record. Yeah. It's a beautiful record, yeah.
Smith, and Adam Rogers. That's how I met Adam Rogers as
Ah,
well.
okay.
And Lonnie Plaxico played bass.
Yeah.
And so I instantly had a very good connection with Dave. I loved his playing and I loved his writing, and
Yeah.
he always had very strong production chops, which are now coming to full fruition in his more later recordings.
Yeah.
And so we stayed friends since and started playing together a lot, and he ended up playing on two of my other recordings, and then he played on La Viquina.
Yeah.
And then we decided to make some collaborative records. So over the years, we've continued to play together and stay friends. And Afinidad, the quartet on that album is, it's a very important group of friends for me. Scott Colley and Brian Blade.
Yeah.
I think I first met Brian on that session.
Oh wow, man, yeah. It's
and I met Scott earlier on on a recording of Dave's, the one he did for big band, or for large ensemble. So those were relationships that were formed that early on, but particularly that rhythm section with Brian and Scott and I.
Scott, yeah.
Was one that was to become very important for me, and that was all through Dave. So that quartet was one that we co-led and played mostly locally in New York, and it's the one that you hear in my album Sorrows and Triumphs as well.
Yeah. I love this group. I mean, for me, this was so influential composition-wise also, because especially Dave, I got the chance to tour with him and play with him when I was really young, and I didn't have anyone, when your CV is empty, and I just sent him an email if he would like to do a tour, and he was immediately really supportive and came to Europe and did a tour and records, and I went to New York, and composition-wise, you guys really influenced me, those records, Afinidad and Oceanos, I think, and
yeah.
Then you start discovering stuff, and especially your generation of guys, you and Dave and Adam Rogers and Scott and Brian, it's for my generation, which is 10 years younger, let's say, it's so important. I think at least I can speak for myself, so that's so cool to hear these connections, how you made that. So
yeah, Dave's writing has been influential to many people, no question. He's such a complete musician,
recognizable. So I mean, really incredible.
Such a recognizable sound, both as a player and as a composer, which is not an easy thing to do, really. And it's I think it's the highest accomplishment as an artist, as a jazz artist especially, is to have an identifiable voice both for your instrument and compositionally. So
Yeah.
that's what I aspire to. I mean, that's what I hear when I listen to the masters like Wayne Shorter. I mean, you
Sure.
recognize a Wayne Shorter tune, instantly,
Yeah, sure.
and his sound on the saxophone as well. Chick Corea the same way.
All the greats, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, Brian is the
so
same blade, he plays like 2 times on the right cymbal, and you're like, man, yeah, that's it. Like Dijonato or all these guys,
right,
it's,
right.
yeah, I love that. But is there something new brewing up with Dave? Because I saw you guys played at Sam Most, I think, or something like that. There's like this
Sam
whole
First.
concert. Sam First, yeah.
Sam First, yes. That's the last time we played together. I was in LA. That was when was that? It was like
I think it's like August. I watched the concert on YouTube.
August. Yes, that's right. It was this summer. Yeah, thank you. I played there 2 nights, and Dave played one of those nights. We played quartet.
Yeah,
He's living in LA now, so whenever I go down to LA, we get the opportunity to play.
yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, cool. Eduardo, there's so many other questions to ask you, but I don't want to take more of your time. There's like still the San Francisco collective stuff you've done, and it's been a huge part the last years.
Talk about maybe we can do a part 2 some other time.
Yeah, definitely. But thanks. I appreciate that you took the time and shared some of these thoughts. I'm really happy. So.
Of course, Sam, it was my pleasure. Thanks for doing this. I want to remind people, of the solo piano album that's out, the solo live, so they can find it on my website or on all the platforms. Yeah, look forward to seeing the interview online.
Yeah.
Dr. Jazz.